All right, everyone. I am here with Luke Stark. Luke is an assistant professor at Western University in London, Ontario. Luke, welcome to the TWiML AI podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you on the show. You are a ethics and AI researcher, among other things, and you've been a vocal critic of computer vision and facial recognition in particular. And I'm looking forward to digging into those topics with you. But before we do, I'd love to have you share a little bit about your background and how you came to work in the field.
Sure thing. It was a kind of an unexpected winding road here. I'm a historian by training, by academic training, and I was not a big computer kid. I liked science fiction a lot, but I was mostly reading books. I wasn't doing too much coding or too much electronical engineering. And ended up doing my PhD in media studies because I kind of got sick of the fact that historians, sort of by convention, often kind of stop their work about 20 to 30 years prior to the present. That's changing a little bit, but that's kind of the tradition. And so I did a PhD in media studies at NYU, and ended up working with a philosopher of technology there named Helen Nissenbaum, who was at the time thinking about digital privacy. And she just came out with a book about privacy in context, the idea that privacy is one of these things that isn't just about control of your data, but it's about kind of socially appropriate or socially contextual data transfers and data flows. And this was about 2010. And as it turned out, Helen had been thinking about not just privacy, but other human values in computing systems since the mid 90s. And she was kind of part of a fairly small niche bunch of folks who were in law schools, in information schools, in media studies departments, who had been thinking about these questions. And that's so I got along. I worked with her, did a bunch of work with her. And about 2016, 2017, all of a sudden, right, there was this huge upsurge in interest in machine learning, right, and also a huge interest in the social impacts of machine learning and ethical AI. And all of a sudden, it felt like all the things we had been talking about in this fairly kind of constrained corners of academia were things that governments were interested in, companies are interested in, the general public is interested in. And so that's been sort of where my work has been ever since. I was sort of just lucky to be in on the ground floor, as they say.
So I mentioned that you have been critical of facial recognition. That seems like a good place to start. One of your articles from a couple of years ago described facial recognition as the plutonium of AI. And in the introduction to that piece, you kind of acknowledge that it comes off to some as alarmist, but then you proceed to back it up, the analogy. Um, tell us about that. Why that analogy, and more importantly, why do you think that facial recognition is so dangerous?
Sure. So that piece was inspired by some earlier work I had been doing with a wonderful friend and colleague, Anna Lauren Hoffman at the University of Washington, on thinking about metaphors in first big data and then eventually AI. And how often these natural metaphors get used, right? We talk about, data mining, data lakes. People call data the new bacon. I mean, it was kind of a bit a
The
bit a
new
bit
oil.
kooky. The new oil, exactly. I prefer the
Hmm.
bacon. Um, and so I was thinking a lot about data metaphors, and I was thinking, okay, so you can use metaphors in a way, to make a product seem, or make data seem appealing, but can thinking about these metaphors do something else? Can it kind of orient people towards some of the challenges and maybe problems with different kinds of AI technologies? And the reason I came to plutonium was because I was reading a lot of, and I was really inspired by work in race and technology studies, right? Work by amazing scholars who have been thinking about the impacts of digital technologies on race and racism, on racial categorization, and how the internet has reshaped those conversations over the last 20 years. People like Lisa Nakamura, Simone Brown, Wendy Chun, really, really amazing scholars. And I want to say, I mean, I think my work is absolutely indebted to and builds on this really path-breaking work of these other people, many of whom are women of color, right? Especially Black women. So right, and what they've been arguing for a long time, for decades, right, is that the way that digital technologies kind of encourage categorization, right? Either new categorizations of people, or they kind of build in old, suspect, problematic, racist categorizations. That has a kind of toxicity because these technologies are now so ubiquitous, right? They're in our pockets. They're making decisions about hiring and bail and all these important things in our lives. And so I take that evidence, historical evidence, empirical evidence from sociologists really seriously. And I think the analogy of plutonium as being physically toxic is to facial recognition as socially toxic, right? And in the at the time that I wrote the piece, I guess that was early 2019, late 2018. The conversation around facial recognition was very different than it is today. That ground has shifted a lot. In 2018, there were a few people in media studies sort of saying this is a really challenging, problematic technology. Woody Herzog and Evan Selinger, two legal scholars, wrote a piece about the kind of democratic danger, the danger to democracy of facial recognition. And then I wrote this piece, and other people had also written other pieces. But I think in the last 2 to 3 years, more and more jurisdictions, right, especially municipalities in the states and elsewhere, have really come to say we don't want this kind of surveillance being used by government. There's often mandates that the police don't use it for obvious reasons, right? Because it is so tied up in this history of unjust policing, of the policing of minorities, especially Black Americans, and so I think that social toxicity of facial recognition has become more. People have become more aware of it, right? They see it in more parts of their everyday lives. There are stories about how it screws up, right? How it doesn't do a good job of capturing certain kinds of faces, and how it can be used to repress dissent. And so I think all of those things have meant that social toxicity is increasingly clear.
One of the distinctions that you make in the piece in your work generally is that the your critique is not so much that it's used improperly. Like we've seen examples of local policing organizations use facial recognition improperly, and they could have used it better perhaps. It's not necessarily that it's used in the wrong domains, but rather your take is that it's fundamentally dangerous, and so dangerous that it shouldn't be used, or should only be used in very, very specific, highly regulated situations, analogous to plutonium. Can you elaborate on where that contention comes from?
Yeah, sure. And I have this kind of folksy analogy. I'm big on analogies, I guess. Of thinking about a rotten onion. So take a rotten onion, right?
Hmm.
You got the onion. It's got these layers, and let's say you take the skin off the onion, and the first layer of the skin of the onion is rotten. That's kind of analogous to the kind of concerns about use and deployment of facial recognition, right? So okay, so right, we have all these problems with it being used by the wrong people in the wrong hands for the wrong reasons. So let's say you say, okay, I accept those problems, I accept those critiques, right? I'll peel that first rotten layer of the onion off, right? Hopefully, maybe the next layer down will be better. Then the second layer of the onion are the kind of concerns about technical bias that have been now widely articulated about facial recognition. So right, so Joe Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru's work on gender shades, right, makes the point that a lot of computer vision data sets and facial recognition data sets are not trained on a diverse set of faces, so they're picking up especially dark skinned women much less precisely than they are picking up white men, right? And there have been lots of
Hmm.
studies. This is a big critique, um, not just recognition, but things like analysis, right? a great scholar, Lauren Rue at University of Maryland, has talked about this in the context of emotion recognition. That emotion recognition systems recognize white smiles better than they recognize black smiles, right? So
Hmm.
similar thing. That's a much harder problem to solve, right? Because of the challenges of getting contextually appropriate data, the challenges of having diverse data sets, the challenges around privacy, right? So there's a whole bunch of technical problems. But let's hypothetically say, and I don't actually think you could fix this, but let's hypothetically say you could fix it. Let's hypothetically say you could peel that second layer of the onion off, that rotten onion. So now you've got like the third, like the core of the onion, right? And to me, this layer of the onion is also rotten in the context of facial recognition, because conceptually, facial recognition systems, right, even though they're not, they're not making any, the people are making the judgments about what the technology is doing, but the system itself is designed to put numbers to faces, right? Quantify the face, and put that face that's quantified in conversation with other faces, right? So even if you are doing simple straightforward identification, right, you're still, you're still identifying the fact there's a face pattern there in the first place, right? And when you start putting that into like databases, and you start looking at how much that kind of comparison of facial vectors, I guess you could say, happens, that kind of quantification of the face, even if it's not intended to be, is really, a big chunk of the textbook definition of racism. Right? Racism is about using a kind of external physical quantification, physical features, and making judgments about an individual based on those features, right? And so, in my view, um, almost every kind of facial recognition technology in some way participates in that kind of quantifiable judgment, and that's why I think that third part of the onion is rotten. Um, and I think, right, if you get rid of that third part of the onion, you have no onion left. And so, there's no point in investing in a rotten onion, if at every layer, at every level, there are these insurmountable problems.
So that third part of the onion, the argument there is that kind of digitizing faces and just any kind of judgment or analysis or decision making based on the digital model of faces
Yeah.
is what
So
is flawed. Is it
the
seems the
the,
first
the
argument.
yeah, the argument is that any kind of digital model of really, it's not just the face, it's the human body more generally, right, is open to exploitability as a kind of around racism, right? So so the textbook definition of racism, right, is using exterior physical traits to make judgments about, the inner self, right? And so all of these systems are doing that first part of that definition. They're all mapping. They're dependent on the kind of quantified mapping of physiological traits of the face, of the body, of whatever. And unless you're not doing anything with that mapping, unless it's purely a descriptive mapping, right? Which is not, I don't think, really how, that's not very useful in a lot of the ways these systems get deployed. Um, then the system, is being asked by its designers, being designed by its designers, to make judgments about the faces, the bodies, the digital profiles that it's taken in, and potentially to put them into a hierarchy, right? Potentially to classify them, potentially to, to act, in the case of facial analysis, right? To say, to make a prediction about age, or about gender, or about whatever. And I just think, right, that so, right, you have there both the kind of textbook definitions of racism. It's quantified external features, being judged in some way, and put into kind of hierarchies, whether deliberately or not, right? So I think one thing important to say here is that I don't think, many technologists and designers think they're being racist, right? They're not. They don't necessarily have racial animus. But one of the things I take from the work of somebody like Wendy Chun, who I mentioned, right, this amazing theorist of race and technology, is that racism itself, race as a concept, is a kind of technology, right? It's kind of a technique, right? It's a technique that the powerful have always used in lots of different contexts. Of course, in the American context, very specifically, often around Black Americans, but racism more broadly, right, between to non-white people. Um, it's a technique, a classificatory technique, right? Race as a concept, um, puts people into particular orders, right? It works a bit like, conceptually, what facial recognition systems or any kind of recognition system that is mapping the body and mapping many bodies and putting them into these databases is um, doing in a dumb way, right? Doing in a way that is just that's what it's meant to do. And I think it's important to think about that kind of systemic definition of race and racism, right? That idea of race as a technique, because you can be using that technique and not be realizing it, right? You can not maybe not realize that that technique is threaded through the kind of classification systems that you're working with.
So you seem to be suggesting that yeah, third core layer of the onion is problematic because it's, you know, or maybe put another way, that all facial recognition is fundamentally racist.
Yeah, if you yeah, basically, if you want to boil it down,
Yeah,
it's
just trying to get to, like, so does
yeah,
that
yeah.
extend to like face unlock for your phone? Is that fundamentally racist?
I think it is. I think it is because just by the act of deciding to put numbers to your face, right? Um, Apple is, or whoever's using Face Unlock, not to pick on Apple, these facial unlock systems are are making a kind of judgment about what a face is, right? They're saying, okay, I'm looking for a particular pattern of light and dark, of whatever, um, and I'm gonna define that pattern as a face. And that's the edge case, right? The edge case, that kind of simple one-to-one recognition, is like the probably the kind of right the argument that that's racist is intrinsic to the quantification aspect, right? It's not because it's one to one. You're not necessarily putting it in conversation with other faces, right? And we talk about this in this paper, Physiognomic AI, I've recently written with a great legal scholar, Jevon Hudson. We talk about that as the edge case. We say there are some, I think some good kind of philosophical reasons why even just the identification of the face with numbers, is kind of suggests, right? It kind of pushes you towards this kind of racializing classification scheme, and certainly when you put multiple faces together, then that kind of produces.
And what is it about the numbers that inherently gives rise to racism? What about other types of judgment based on faces? Like, we go through life all day making judgment based on faces. Does that mean that human existence is fundamentally racist?
No, but I think human existence is fundamentally based on these kind of inferences about people, these conjectures about people. This is a great question,
Right.
right? This is actually often a response that you get when you talk about these problems.
Okay.
You say, okay, yeah, people do this all the time. People are always making judgments about people based on what they look like and their face. And there are a couple of things to say about that. First, right, there are sort of right these two battling folk sayings, right? You can't judge a book by its cover, versus
Mhm.
you never get a second chance to make a first impression, right? So there's this kind of opinion is divided, right, about just how useful these individual inferences about people are, right? And there's been lots of work in psychology that talks about how much stereotype and other kind of incorrect inference permeates what we're doing a lot of the time in our daily lives. we're much better at making inferences about people if we know them well, right? So I know I can kind of infer things about my mother, what she's thinking or how she's feeling, that I wouldn't be able to infer from a total stranger. And the real problem, right, then becomes, so there are all these problems with this kind of individual personal level inference. Um, Lots of books have been written about it, right? Lots of songs have been
Sure.
written about, etc. Okay, but when you try to scale that, right? When you try to say, okay, we're going to make a science out of this, we're going to find kind of regular and repeatable patterns in these in faces. We're going to infer from one particular person's, you know, whatever, some set of things about them with some degree of accuracy, right? That's when it all breaks down, right? Because it's too brittle, right? It's not, you're never going to be able to um capture the kind of the potentially the reason why that inference works. And that inference, even if it's 70% accurate at a population level, is also never going to be reapplicable down to the individual level, right? This is called, it's called the ecological fallacy in statistics.
Just to be clear, so you're shifting focus in the conversation to the paper you did, which is the physiognomic AI, and that is broadly a critique of these kinds of studies that will try to look at faces and determine any number of things. What are some examples of like the most egregious things you've seen?
Sure. Well, so race is one of them, right? I
Hmm.
think so. In terms of my own trajectory, right? So thinking about race and facial recognition, right? Well, it's not just race or ethnicity that these systems purport to predict, claim to be able to predict. They claim to be able to do things like predict your gender, your
Hmm.
age, your emotion, your sexual orientation, your
Hmm.
political leanings, right? There's been a whole raft of kind of dubious machine learning, kind of prediction studies. And I think race is a really critical example here, because
Hmm.
it's exactly what we're talking about, but at a bigger, the physiognomic AI, and the problem is that it's at a scale that's not just about race, right? It's looking at these these various identity categories, and trying to make assumptions about that identity category, um, in ways that, at that macro level, at that level of populations, that then gets translated back down to the individual, can often be wrong, right? It can be inaccurate, and whether or not it is accurate or not, it can, if it's used in various ways, it's hugely damaging.
My general sense is that most of the technologists I interact with look at these studies, very critically, to say the least, and wonder how they get published. But of course, people write them and publish them.
Yeah, and I think there's a whole conversation to have about, an interesting conversation to have about, basic machine learning research and applied machine learning research, and how even when researchers don't quite realize it, the line between them is very, very narrow, right? I was a postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft Research, in their fairness group for 2 years, and I mean, I really saw this firsthand, right? A lot of researchers, have good intentions. They actually really want, um, tools and scaffolding to do a good job, and to not trace into these problematic deployments. And so there is a kind of a set of structural questions around research, but it's just, right, it's so easy to productize this stuff, right? I'm thinking especially of these various smartphone filters and apps, right, where, they say, oh, we'll turn your face into an 80-year-old man's face, or we'll morph it so that you look stereotypically female or something, right? And that's really easy to do, but I think it's also another example of how ubiquitous, like this kind of trying to this digitizing of the features, and kind of this categorizing of features is becoming, because of facial recognition. And I think, those filters, okay, maybe they're in good fun, except for the, when you have a filter that says, make, a beautifying filter, and that beautifying filter, the actual, visual effect is to lighten your skin, right, or is to change the shape of your face. So that's a huge problem. Yeah, so that's. I mean, I agree. I mean, there is a lot of good internally critical work in machine learning and in the tech sector, and I think increasingly large amounts of it. I think I I was asked to give a talk about this stuff at CVPR earlier this year, and yeah, and there was a lot of a lot of interest and a lot of thoughtful conversation about it. I think that the I think that there's a real anxiety on the part of a lot of researchers about censorship, right, and about sort of being told what to research and what not to research. And I think that anxiety, I think that that anxiety is understandable, but I think if we all stop to think for a little bit, there are lots of boundaries on what kinds of research we do, right? And there are lots of kind of ethical rules and guidelines, and in every academic discipline. Nobody's just kind of just out there kind of plowing over every social constraint. And so I think because there's been this body of work that thinks seriously about things like classification. um, I think it's time, and I think it is. I think it's good that it's now being thought about in computer vision.
Yeah, we've talked quite a bit about kind of the, I don't know if you call it changing perceptions, but kind of the broader context in which we're evaluating facial recognition. We've alluded to some of the shifts that have happened in the acceptability of using facial recognition in policing. How would you characterize I guess, the regulatory landscape or the legal landscape? I know that's a topic that you're interested in. And of course, it's, there's many municipalities. It's hard to do broadly, but what do you think are the kind of the major landmarks recently?
Yeah. So yeah, municipal bans or moratoria on facial recognition have been a big kind of part of the regulatory landscape of the last couple of years in the U.S. Cities like, I believe, like Oakland, like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then also new focus on laws that protect broadly things like biometric privacy, right? The Illinois biometric privacy law is just one of the strongest in the states, and it has been like very heavily attacked by various big tech firms because it stops various kinds of filters, various kinds of facial tech from being deployed or used in Illinois. So I think that's been notable. I think that there has, of course, been in the American context a lot of conversation in Congress about tech regulation broadly. Unclear if we'll actually see any legislation. But what has been notable is the kind of recent set of hirings at the FTC, right, the Federal Trade Commission, which is sort of become the kind of de facto tech regulator. It has been for a long time around privacy because of its mandate to to deal with unfair or deceptive business practices, of which there have been sort of many in the context of kind of privacy breaches and dark patterns and that kind of thing. And so I think that the FTC is really gearing up to think about all these questions kind of holistically, not just privacy, but also, and this is something we argue for in this recent paper, but for understanding things like biometric classification and physiognomic classification as potentially being per se unfair and deceptive, precisely because, right, you're doing a kind of a classification on an individual, right, that is making assumptions about the individual, right, that may not be accurate, right? No classifier is 100% accurate. And so that may be both unfair and deceptive, right, depending on the context.
Yeah, yeah. When you looked at the physiognomic AI landscape, what did you find was the kind of the motivator behind that work? Was it, people with the data set and just playing around? Was it, yeah, I don't know. I look at a lot again. we look at these and like, you see them pop up on Twitter every few months and it's like, okay, once again, correlation not equal causation, blah, blah, blah. And I'm curious, where they come from in terms of thinking.
Yeah, and I think there's a kind of complex, like, overlapping set of motivation. I think that the world of academic prestige and reputation and controversy and PR does a lot in fueling some of this work, right? I think, if you
Mm,
right if you publish this study that makes this kind of big claim about being able to tell somebody's sexual orientation via a data set, or by facial recognition, or political orientation, right? You're going to get written up in all the tech press, right? It's part of the kind of ecosystem of content and clickable headlines and everything in it.
mm,
I think there, so sometimes there's more serious work or more interesting work, um that gets written up in a sensational way, and then there's work that kind of I think is aimed at kind of getting these sensational headlines. So I think that's part of it. I think, and I also am really aware of the kind of very heated nature of ML research. Right. I mean, there's a lot of money involved. There's all this back and forth between the private sector and universities. Um, everybody's incentivized to make big claims, right? And
mhm,
and 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 especially the press is sort of incentivized to not be careful about either the claims that they make, or checking the claims that people make. Um, and then and then governments pick up on it, and they sometimes they sort of believe it, right? Or people companies believe it, customers believe it. You want customers to believe it because you want to sell them the technology
mhm,
at a certain level. And I think that's a lot of where this is all coming from, and this kind of swirling hype world, around machine learning, and this desire, right? There's a real desire to want to peel back the skin and, like, get to the truth of things about people, right? That's not a desire that started with machine learning. Machine learning is just the latest tool that kind of keeps that kind of desire going, right? In the paper that you mentioned, the physiognomic AI, we talk a lot about the 19th century. No computers then, but a similar set of desires to kind of try to, like, identify people from their exterior traits, right? A similar set of desires, to categorize people, to kind of understand who people are and what they're doing. And I think that kind of desire for that certainty. I think that's actually the core problem, right? It's that these technologies are the symptom, but this huge unease about that you might have to, like, actually engage with somebody and find out their perspective, as opposed to running some sort of sensor over them and getting information about them. I think that's a much longer history, and that's where I think actually being a historian in this context is really helpful, because, right, the tech is new, that kind of ideology, or that kind of wish is not.
mm, mhm. In that paper, did you find examples, or in your research broadly in the area, did you find examples of commercial products that are based on this research or ideas?
There have been lots of applications of the kind of simple emotion analysis, for instance, right, and things like hiring, right? So HireVue was a famous case, right? They have claimed that they've stopped doing a lot of the kind of facial recognition, or facial analysis work on emotion, but there's still a lot of concerns about hiring in general. There are a lot of really alarming examples in the kind of sort of law enforcement and national security space, both in the United States and overseas, right? About around kind of doing these analyses, making judgments and assumptions about suspects, and there's an increasing interest in using these technologies in education, right? The pandemic has really meant, right, a lot more screen time, and a whole bunch of companies have sort of moved into this space, promising analytics to help children learn, right, which involves analyzing their attentiveness analyzing their, their demeanor, stuff like that. So, it's a kind of it is a quite a heterogeneous set of technologies, and not every technology is seeking to classify or identify the same thing. And so in the paper, we tried to kind of get as high level a kind of definition as we could to kind of capture the broad range of where we see the tech going.
So, I wanted to kind of introduce into the conversation some late breaking news. This is not characteristic for the this podcast, but since we started our recording, Facebook announced that they're going to be shutting down their facial recognition system. Obviously, you haven't been reading that, but you've been following what the company's been doing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's first of all indicative of how toxic the term facial recognition has gotten. Also, apparently, how ubiquitous. Somebody the other day was mentioning that people sort of sometimes kind of use facial recognition as synonymous for any kind of computer vision, right? Oh, we use
Mhm.
facial recognition to identify this guitar. That's interesting. But anywho, facial recognition, as a term, is clearly really toxic, and clearly something that the tech companies don't want to be involved with. Um, Facebook is, of course, rebranding itself, right? It's
Yeah.
had a lot of press this week, going to Meta, talking about the metaverse. What's the metaverse? The metaverse is virtual reality, right? The metaverse
Mhm.
is about it, which includes creating digital avatars of users, right? Facebook has been researching how to do physiological scans of bodies to produce more precise, more accurate avatars for some time,
Mhm.
and so uh, Facebook may be shutting down some aspect of its photo facial recognition, right? But Facebook is still very interested in collecting data about the body and
Mm.
using that data to collect information about its users to model it. In fact, VR technologies collect enormous amounts of data, not just about the face, right, but about heart rate, movement, right, you name it, right? They're doing a very granular scan of what how you're moving, how you're acting. It's interesting that this comes up actually because there is a whole connection with these conversations around facial recognition and physiognomy and stereotypes with animation, actually, right?
Mm.
Animation in terms of cartoons, in terms of CGI, right? And one of the big challenges with animation is that the easiest way to convey emotion in animation is through a stereotype. It's through some kind of physical, big eyes or it's tiny mouth, right?
Mhm.
And so you get all of these conventions, all these stereotypes from animation that begin to inflect how we think about people, how we think about people's emotional expression, and their other kinds of expression. And now we're getting to the point, right, where social media companies are trying to collect, trying to animate users, right, for their own ends. An interesting move by Facebook, but not maybe totally shocking or unexpected.
You also raise an interesting point that while they are shutting down facial recognition, in many ways, their stated direction requires a lot requires them to do what you find most frustrating about facial recognition, which is digitize the body and make representations of that maybe in some other universe or some digital world.
Right, some digital representation, exactly, and and a bunch of companies have done this over the last couple of years, right? So, what did Amazon said they were going to do a moratorium on using their facial recognition systems for police departments?
Hmm.
Okay, well, that's very narrow. All these announcements from various companies sounded good. They got good headlines, right? If you dug into it, they were either they weren't really in that business anyway, and so there was no skin off their back to say they weren't going to be in it anymore, right? Or it was a very limited part of what they were
Hmm.
providing. So yeah, I think that's deflection, right, on Facebook's part. And I think again that's actually partially um why we really wanted to go beyond facial recognition, right, in this paper and say there's this whole class of classifying technologies and classificatory technologies, And because you don't because we don't we don't want to play whack-a-mole all the time, right? People in tech often complain that regulators can't keep up with the technology, but part of that is because of the argument that every technology is new, even if some of these technologies have a lot of common denominators in terms of their
Mhm.
conceptual basis or their technical basis. Um, and so that's kind of I think a ban on physiognomic AI analysis, yeah, would you could apply that to thinking about virtual reality avatars, especially if those
Mm.
are grounded in digital data, and if they're being if machine learning is being used to extrapolate or data animation.
Do you have a goal in terms of kind of a regulatory framework or a thought in terms of what that needs to look like to be effective?
Yeah. So again, this is where the historian hat comes in kind of handy. I think that, right, as I sort of have been saying, this problem of trying to infer things about people at scale is a pretty old problem, right? At least a couple of hundred years old, and it it for a long time was sort of felt by two groups of people, broad groups of people: experts in the lab, right, scientists of various kinds, and the kind of often marginalized populations who got experimented on, right, whether that's very broadly, right, whether that's people in colonial, in colonized societies who are getting 19th century scientists, administrators, going in and doing stuff to them, whether that's poor people in Europe and North America, right? So, right, those marginalized people, understood the kind of injustices of these sorts of classifications very well. But the kind of privileged, and I count myself as part of this group, right? Kind of privileged in North America, white middle class people, they didn't really always see the kind of negative side of classification and quantification. So now with AI being so ubiquitous and being deployed, right, in white collar professions, right, in all sorts of different spaces, um I think it just means that the injustices and power asymmetries of classification of the body are now more apparent to people for whom they weren't always apparent before. And so, right, so that means it's an old problem that people are suddenly waking up to, not some sort of new problem. And so I think the end game in terms of regulation is to think really carefully about when you do inference about humans at all, right? What kind of inference you do? Is that inference being done solely for research, right? Are certain kind of inferences that are done for research, does that put that research off limits for commercialization? um how do governments, how do states, handle the kind of data that they have under their control, and the kind of inferences they make based on that data about humans? I think that's a conversation that is happening, been happening sort of in patches, but I think as an overarching theme needs to happen more, which is something I'm thinking about, right? Because not all inference is physiognomic, but all physiognomy is inference, right? So there's physiognomic AI. That's a category we know there's a problem. That's what we're talking about in the paper. There's a higher level category about doing any kind of inference about data about humans that I think we're at the beginning of a bigger conversation about.
Maybe going all the way back to the onion to kind of wrap things up. Uh, what would you point, me or anyone else who's not quite bought into that third layer of the onion as being, fundamentally wrong? Like I can buy that, MLAI facial recognition is misused all the time. I can buy that people, that the technology is not quite there yet and is problematic in its current state, of applicability, particularly in some use cases. I'm not sure that I'm fully bought into, digitizing faces, digitizing bodies is fundamentally wrong or fundamentally racist, like for that matter. What are
Sure,
the
sure.
best book or books or articles for us to take a look at?
Yeah, so you could start. There's a famous book by Stephen Jay Gould called "The Mismeasure of Man." That's a good introduction to thinking about phrenology and physiognomy in the 19th century, and kind of thinking about this history of why people's bodies get quantified in that way.
Mhm.
The work of yeah, so the work of some of the people I've already mentioned, of Wendy Chun, who's at Simon Fraser University out in Vancouver, talking about race and racism as a technique or as a technology. The work of Simone Brown at UT Austin, who talks about the sort of history of classification and racial surveillance of Black Americans, going back to the enslaved people, and to kind of anti escape slave laws.
It's been a long time since I've come across the Gould book, but my immediate reaction to those is that we're kind of circling back to layer one of the onion, which is the use. Like, I get racist use of facial recognition is racist,
Right.
but like fundamentally any digitization of a face as being racist, like
Right. So if you again, right, if you take the definition of racism as being assigning some metric to an external feature and to using it to make a judgment about the person, right? I mean, that's in some ways, maybe yeah, maybe we've done a kind of like a full circle loop, right?
yeah.
That is both a use case, but it's also fundamental to what these systems do, right? So it's conceptual. It's the concept. The point. It's almost tautological, right? The point of facial recognition is to assign a set of numbers to a face and make a judgment about that face, right? That's it. And if that's like that is the textbook definition of racism being, making a judgment about your skin, your external
Mhm.
self. So yeah, so I think in some ways it does loop around, but I think that's part of the problem is that people don't always get that's what that really at bottom that's what racism is, right?
Mhm.
It's not being being irrationally, it's not being irrationally bigoted or something, right? Racism is a technique, right? It has this like this kind of materiality to it. And so you can, yes, that's why you can be racist without realizing it, right? You can be racist, with the best of intentions, which kind of ties into bigger conversations we're having these days,
Mhm.
in society. And so I think your point is right, but I think it does come around to that fundamental question of what, right, what conceptually is putting numbers to humans about, right?
Mhm.
And I think there's a question here, interesting question here about, I mean, okay, so you could say, let's say, like, in some medical cases, right, you want to, you want to, quantify a spleen or something, or a lung, right?
Right.
Is that racist? Well, there's certainly a lot of potential for racism or racial disparity to come into those medical data, and there's been lots of studies about
Mhm.
that. Is that quite the same? Jury's still out, right? So I think, right. So I think
Mhm.
I think that's a fair point, right? That quantifying a particular organ, and we that's something to talk about. But the face, right? The face is so central to the way we identify each other and the way we understand each other socially, that I don't think you can quantify the face without stumbling into that problem.
Mm. Well, there's no question that it's dangerous. No question that it is, lends itself or is available for misuse. No question that it's easy to do wrong, and that we see a lot of examples where, data sets and algorithms and all these things contribute to misuse. So I'm
Food,
glad
food,
that
food, food for thought. Food for
food,
thought for
food for
your
thought, and I'm glad
audience.
folks like you are out there, keeping an eye on it. And I'd love to get your take once you get a chance to actually dig into this Facebook news. Interesting timing.
No kidding. Well, it's never a dull moment in this business, I have to say. Boy, kind of wish there'd be a down week, but hasn't happened yet.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Luke.
Thanks so much.